Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really complex and, frankly, pretty difficult topic. It's based on a stack of sources you've shared with us.
Yeah, we've got quite a mix here.
We do. Everything from a news piece about a specific arrest right at a San Diego courthouse, then official data from ICE, and also reports looking at the wider impact and the legal side of these kinds of arrests.
It's definitely one of those areas where different government functions and, well, people's actual lives intersect in pretty significant ways. Lots of layers here.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's try and unpack this. Our mission for this deep dive, really, is to get a clear picture of what happened in that San Diego case first. Then we'll zoom out, look at the official context, the scale, from ICE's own data.
Right.
And finally, explore the bigger picture, the consequences, the whole debate around making immigration arrests inside courthouses.
Yeah.
It's about getting past just the headlines, seeing the full landscape these sources paint.
Sounds like a plan.
So let's start right there in San Diego. NBC reported on this specific case. It involved a 22-year-old man identified as Jose who was seeking asylum.
Yeah, and according to his lawyer, Michael Herman, Jose's background is, well, it's quite specific. He was apparently a lieutenant in the Venezuelan army.
Wow.
And even had specialized training in Cuba. But he fled. The source says he saw oppression and just couldn't tolerate the corruption by the communist regime as he saw it.
And he wasn't just anyone. He was apparently decorated for his services before deciding to defect. That's a huge step.
A massive decision. And his journey here, it involved trekking through the Darien Gap.
Which is incredibly dangerous.
Exactly. He got to San Diego in January to claim political asylum.
And his lawyer, Herman, really emphasizes why Jose said he came here.
Right. Herman says Jose hoped to join the U.S. military, that he loves freedom, loves what we stand for, and is willing to give his life to defend this country.
Strong words.
Yeah. Herman even called him precisely the kind of candidate that we look for in the United States to be an asylee. High praise.
Okay, so what makes this case really jump out is when the arrest actually happened. It was during a routine hearing at the federal courthouse.
Yeah, and things seemed to be looking up for him in that hearing.
How so?
Well, the Department of Homeland Security was actually moving to dismiss his case there and send it over to USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services for, further processing.
Which, from the lawyer's point of view...
That sounds good.
Right, definitely. Herman saw it as a victory, like a sign his asylum claim was moving forward, that Jose might get to stay in the U.S. It felt like progress in court.
But then, as Jose was leaving the courtroom with his lawyer, things took a sharp turn.
A dramatic turn. ICE agents were apparently waiting right there in the hallway. Another source, news source, reported they seemed to have, a list of targets.
And they arrested him there. Right there, agents grabbed his arm, handcuffed him, surrounded him. Herman described a pretty intense scene, Jose collapsing, face down on the ground, gasping, sweating.
Oh, wow.
Needing agents to actually prop him up against the wall. It sounds chaotic.
His attorney's reaction. You can feel the shock.
Yeah, Herman said it felt like they tricked us. He described Jose going from being embraced in his aunt's arms, thinking that the case was over, to horror.
And his aunt thought he was dying.
That's what Herman quoted her thinking. He's dead. He is going to die. Just paints a picture of absolute terror right there in the courthouse.
And this lawyer, Herman, he's experienced
over 20 years in immigration law. And he told the reporter he'd never seen something like that happen before.
That says a lot.
It does. And the source also really conveys the family's fear. Deep fear for his life if he gets deported.
His uncle said he'd be killed.
And Herman basically agreed, saying he expects Jose would be shot immediately as a deserter at the very least, if not an enemy of the state. Really stark warning.
The attorney also brought up a practical point, the cost.
Yeah, he argued the detention is just a waste of money. His point was, before the arrest, Jose wasn't costing taxpayers a dime.
But now he's in detention.
Exactly. Now the public pays to feed and clothe him 3 meals a day, shelter, medical, that whole cost.
And it's worth noting, both the NBC and news source articles said ICE didn't respond to their requests for comment.
Right, not on Jose's specific case, or even the general practice of courthouse arrests, at least at the time they reported. A news source also mentioned it wasn't immediately clear what the specific charges were that the agents were using for the arrest.
Okay, so that's the specific story. Very human, very dramatic, one courthouse. But let's zoom out now. What's the official picture look like? We have the ICE fiscal year 2023 annual report. That covers up to September 30th, 2023.
Right, and the report itself kind of sets the scene. It calls FY 2023 a year of unprecedented change and increased demands, basically saying their workforce was strained.
And their mission, as they stated?
It's broad, combating terrorism, cybercrime, drug trafficking, but also, crucially, upholding immigration laws. Their ERO division enforcement and removal operations was key in supporting DHS's Southwest border mission.
Okay, so what about the numbers? Did ERO activity go up?
It did. They reported 170,590 administrative arrests in FY 2023.
And compared to the year before?
That's a 19.5% increase over fiscal year 2022.
Wow, okay.
And within that, they specifically track what they call at-large arrests. These are enforcement actions, out in the community, not inside prisons or jails.
Right.
They reported 91,497 of those. That's a 7.2% increase from the previous year.
And at-large can include people checking in at an ICE office.
Yeah, the report clarifies that. It can include non-citizens encountered by CBP at the border who were paroled and then later check in with ERO or are just taken into custody for removal out in the community.
So how does ICE generally find these individuals? How do they target them?
The report mentions a few different teams and programs. They have fugitive operations teams, FOTs, and mobile criminal apprehension teams, MCATs. Those focus on finding removable non-citizens who are at large.
Okay.
And then for people already in prisons or jails due to criminal activity, they have something called the Criminal Apprehension Program, or CAP.
Got it. The report also talks about removals, right? People actually sent out of the country.
Exactly. Big numbers there, too. In FY 2023, ICE ran 11,178 removal flights.
How many people?
Over 142,000 non-citizens removed to more than 170 different countries.
How does that compare?
That's a huge jump, a 97.5% increase compared to FY 2022 removals. And they're careful to point out that this doesn't include Title 42 expulsions, which was that different border policy.
Okay. What about criminal history? Does the report say anything about the people removed?
It does. It states that 69,902 of those removed. That works out to 49%. So almost half had charges or convictions for criminal activity. That's a figure that often comes up, in discussions about who ICE prioritizes.
And I remember seeing Venezuela mentioned specifically in the removal stats.
Yes, good catch. They removed 834 individuals to Venezuela in FY 2023.
Which is way up from before, wasn't it?
Yeah, quite a sharp increase. It was only 176 in FY 2022, and the same number, 176, in FY 2021. So a noticeable change there.
The ICE report mentions some other things too, right? Just briefly.
Yeah, it touches on other activities. HSI, Homeland Security investigations, doing work against TCOs, drugs, cybercrime, human exploitation, that kind of thing.
Okay.
They also highlight a hotline, VESL Victims Engagement and Services Line. Got over 42,000 calls, apparently helped in over 100 victim cases.
Mm-hmm. And
some tech stuff, an online address change tool that over 34,000 people use, something called the IC Portal, a secure docket card project, and alternatives to detention, ATD programs. They even mentioned piloting a GPS wrist device.
Okay, but critically, there's a specific piece of ICE guidance that's really central to this whole courthouse arrest debate.
Yes, their interim guidance, civil immigration enforcement actions in or near courthouses. This is key.
And what does it cover?
It specifically covers civil immigration enforcement actions. So things like apprehending someone, arresting them, interviewing them, searching them, but all related to administrative immigration violations, not necessarily criminal charges.
Okay, administrative violations. And the really crucial part.
The guidance explicitly says it does not apply to criminal immigration enforcement inside courthouses.
Ah, so there's the distinction.
Exactly. And that's where a lot of the debate and the legal pushback seems to center this difference between civil versus criminal actions happening in this specific place, the courthouse.
Right. So we've seen the individual story, the human impact, and we've seen the big picture numbers from ICE. Now let's dive into the broader conversation, the impact these courthouse arrests reportedly have. We're drawing here from sources looking at New York, some mentions of Texas. This is where that phrase chilling effect really comes into play.
That's right. Sources like the Immigrant Defense Project report out of New York, they are highly critical. They call IC courthouse operations a dangerous practice.
And they saw a big increase.
A huge increase, according to their report. A 1,200% increase in courthouse arrests from 2016 to 2017 just in New York State. And they said it escalated further in 2018. This is what fueled efforts like the campaign for the Protect Our Courts Act there.
And who's raising these criticisms? It sounds like a wide range of people.
It really is. Impacted individuals, obviously, but also community groups, lawyers, even judges and prosecutors, advocates.
And what are their main arguments? What are they worried about?
The core argument is that this practice creates these harmful barriers. It stops people from accessing courts and crucial services, and not just defendants, right? We're talking witnesses, victims of crime, people involved in custody battles or housing disputes.
So basically anyone needing the court system.
Pretty much. They argue it threatens public safety because if people are afraid to come to court, crimes might go unreported, abusers aren't held accountable, and they feel it undermines the whole point of the court system, its legal and moral underpinnings.
There was a survey mentioned from the Immigrant Defense Project in New York back in 2017 of lawyers and advocates.
Yes, of 225 legal service providers and advocates. And the findings were pretty stark.
Like what?
Well, 3 out of 4 clients, 75% expressed fear of just going to court because they were worried about IC.
3 out of 4. Wow.
And nearly a third, 29%, reported they had worked with immigrant clients who actually failed to show up for court specifically because of that fear.
That has real consequences.
Huge consequences. And the impact on survivors of violence was particularly highlighted.
What do they find there?
Get this. 67%, 2/3 of those surveyed, said they had clients who decided not to seek help from the courts at all because they were afraid of running into IC there.
That's staggering. Not seeking help because you're afraid of the place you're supposed to get help.
Exactly. And the survey gave specific examples. Like 37% had clients who backed away from pursuing an order of protection.
Against an abuser.
Presumably, yeah.
Yeah.
And 48% had clients afraid to seek custody or visitation rights for their children. There are quotes from advocates that just drive it home. One survivor advocate said her client was afraid to go to court to seek an order of protection against her husband. She is terrified that being in court puts her and her family at greater risk of being deported.
So the fear of deportation outweighs the immediate physical danger sometimes.
It seems so. Another case involved a client whose abusive husband actually threatened to call immigration so that they would take her away. So for her, not showing up in court, maybe out of fear, could mean her abuser automatically gets custody of the kids. An impossible situation.
And this fear isn't just in family court or criminal court, right? It affects other areas, too.
No, definitely not. The survey looked at housing court as well. Over half, 56% of the housing advocates surveyed had clients who were afraid to even file a housing court complaint against, say, a landlord violating their rights because they feared IC.
Crippling paralysis.
That's the phrase one housing advocate used. This fear has transformed into crippling paralysis in the wake of IC activity in New York State courts.
And beyond the survey data, there were specific stories, anecdotes that illustrate this.
Yeah, really powerful ones, like the story of a woman who suffered severe neurological damage, permanent vision loss, because of abuse, rape, and beatings by the father of her kids.
But she didn't report it.
She was too afraid of being picked up by IC to report the abuse or even seek a restraining order.
That's just awful.
And another anecdote described a human trafficking victim who was in what's supposed to be a safe space courtroom being watched by plainclothes IC officers. And then another woman was arrested just minutes after she left that specialized human trafficking court.
So even in courts designed to help the most vulnerable.
The fear, or the actual presence of IC, was reportedly there. And remember that case of the man from Ivory Coast in the Bronx?
Right, the one who came as a kid?
Yeah, 29 years old, brought here at age 3, married to a U.S. citizen, working, applying for college, applying for a green card, no criminal record.
And he was arrested.
Ambushed, reportedly, by 8 to 10 ICD officers outside the Bronx courthouse. He was just there for a misdemeanor case. This really highlights the point about civil enforcement actions happening around court appearances.
And we see similar concerns popping up at other places, too, like Texas.
Right. Sources looking at Texas mention that undocumented immigrants there seem more reluctant to call the police or press charges or testify against people who've assaulted them.
Which makes prosecuting cases harder.
Exactly. One survey mentioned across 50 states found 82% of prosecutors said domestic abuse cases are harder to prosecute when victims are too afraid to cooperate. The source also touched on the U visa backlog, those visas for crime victims who help law enforcement. Huge backlog, like 33,500 applications versus a 10,000 annual cap in 1 year mentioned.
Meaning help is delayed or maybe never comes for many.
Potentially, yeah. And there's this really powerful quote from a woman in Texas. She lost a pregnancy after her partner beat her while she was pregnant. He later threatened to kill her.
Did she report him?
She fled instead. She said she was too afraid to come forward because she feared deportation. And even later, she said she's still afraid of the courts. That fear lingers.
Okay. Let's try and pull all these threads together now. We've got the San Diego case, the ICE data, the reports on the impact, particularly in New York and Texas. What's the big picture that emerges here?
Well, I think what you really see is this fundamental tension, right? On one side, you have ICE with its mission to enforce immigration laws. That includes finding and arresting people who are removable. Their data shows increased activity. They have specific teams for it.
And from their perspective, courthouses might be seen as, well, a place where individuals they're looking for might be present.
Potentially, yeah. A predictable location, perhaps. But then on the other side, you have the justice system itself, the courts, the lawyers, the advocates raising these really serious flags. About access to justice, definitely, but also about the basic functioning of the courts. They're worried that this kind of enforcement activity actually undermines the court's ability to do its job, whether that's protecting victims, ensuring fair trials, resolving disputes, you name it.
Because people are afraid to even walk through the door.
Precisely. And that distinction we talked about in the ICE guidance, allowing criminal enforcement but putting some limits on civil enforcement near courthouses?
That doesn't really solve the conflict.
It doesn't seem to, based on these reports, especially the ones from New York. A lot of the concern is squarely focused on civil immigration arrests, picking people up for administrative violations, not necessarily for committing new crimes.
Right.
The argument from advocates, and seemingly behind things like the Protect Our Courts Act, is that using courthouses for any kind of civil immigration enforcement, unless there's a specific judicial warrant for that arrest, creates that chilling effect. It makes people terrified of seeking protection or pursuing their legal rights because they fear being arrested for a civil violation and deported.
So it really boils down to a clash, doesn't it, between the operational goals of one government agency and maybe the foundational principles of another part of the system, like the courts wanting universal access.
I think that's a good way to put it. These sources, taken together, show that while ICE is carrying out its mandate and reporting its results, the wearer of some of that enforcement, specifically in or near courthouses, has these ripple effects. Documented consequences that spread through the justice system, potentially making it harder for courts to protect vulnerable people, resolve cases fairly, or even contribute to public safety.
Yeah, this deep dive really paints a complicated picture, doesn't it? How immigration enforcement and the justice system bump up against each other. That specific case in San Diego, it puts such a human face on the immediate shock and fear of an arrest happening in a place you might expect process, maybe even safety. Then, the official data gives us that sense of scale, the numbers, who ICE says they're removing.
Right, the context.
But then the reports from New York and the mentions from Texas, they show these broader systemic consequences, how the fear of enforcement in that specific location can impact court access, victim safety, really the whole administration of justice.
It really forces you to think about how the actions taken by one agency pursuing its goals can directly affect the ability of another really vital institution, the courts, to serve everyone who comes before it.
Exactly. Which leads us to maybe a final provocative thought for you to consider. If courthouses are supposed to be these fundamental public spaces, right? Places where anyone, regardless of their status, should be able to seek protection, resolve conflicts, deal with legal obligations. What does it actually mean for that core principle, the principle of equal access to justice, when the fear of being arrested in that very building keeps people away?